Not quite sure what he said there. Okay. Welcome. Welcome to this fourth and next to last lesson this year in the session, this year's session. I'm Tommaso Bertolazzi. I'm a researcher in the Sofia University Institute, and I'm the moderator of this course. This year, our course has the title of Conscience, where people are alone with God. This title is from a document from the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, number 12, and we're going to look at some documents of the Church which speak about moral conscience. And in order to do that, we have Andrea Vodka, Professor Andrea Vodka, who is a Redemptorist, born in Poland. He got his theological license in the Biblical Institute in Rome. Then between 1989 and 92, he worked for his order in Poland as a teacher, formator, and vocational director. He obtained a doctorate in biblical theology in the Gregorian University, and he was invited to continue his service in the Alfonsonian Academy, teaching moral theology in the style of Paul and John, and also Old Testament moral theology. Since 2015, he's been at the Alfonsian Academy. Between 2013 and 18, he was president of the Academy. In 2018, he was named by Pope Francis to the agency of the Holy See for the evaluation and promotion of quality in university and ecclesiastical faculties, and is now the president of that body. He'll be president until 2023. So now I'm going to hand over to Professor Vodka, and we'll interrupt it halfway through so that you can take notes. You can prepare questions. We'll have the possibility of writing to a WhatsApp address here, which you will see displayed on the screen. You can see the number of this WhatsApp number, +39 392 276 4391. There it is. So you can send comments and pose questions using this. So, good listening.
The Church's understanding of personal conscience. Conscience and freedom. That would be the title. About 60 years have passed from the time of the Vatican Council to today. And in these decades, the main magisterial perspectives of Vatican II and of the immediate post-conciliar period have emerged. The progressive post-conciliar rereading is present in every subsequent pontificate, and the theme will therefore be developed in two parts: the conciliar turning point, including Paul VI, and the subsequent developments up to date. I want to add to this text, when we talk about this turning point, maybe before it was the predominance of law in conscience, and now it's the person who matters, and there's a whole order of the beauty of cosmos that's included in this. I want to thank my colleagues from the the academy where I work, because I'm more in the biblical area. But there was one of my colleagues who helped me in preparing this talk. And from their rich patrimony, I've been able to draw in a very sketchy way what the church says about conscience. Its gift, the gift that it is, and also it's a mystery. In this first part, we'll talk about conscience in the vision of Vatican II and in the immediate post-conciliar period. First of all, I want to speak about the mystery of conscience today. From previous lessons, we've learned how conscience continues to be a question that's been continuously debated. Almost everyone is now trying to promote their own understanding of it. And the concept isn't understood in the same way everywhere. This is historically caused by the plurality of anthropologies, by the profound differences between transcendental and immanentistic visions, by the different semantic contents that the term assumes. The previous tradition privileged the idea of a strong conscience as the voice of values or principles that existed before. Today, there's more and more talk of a weak conscience, the result of the complex and dramatic historicity of individual people. But there are also And also today we're witnesses of this fratricide, which is taking place, which is what's taking place now between nations who are supposedly Christian. So it's a very historic and complex situation. There are also the dynamics of suspicion and the emptying of conscience rooted in the prevalence of perspectives that highlight efficiency, economic, scientific, and medical perspectives, and fundamentalist interpretations attribute responsibility for violence and war to conscience. And we know these today. Moreover, today, fear Oh, no, here everything changes. Are people translating me?
verifico in nessun modo, sono verificato piuttosto. Allora, non sei.
Ecco, ma l'essere qui svela anche un certo legame con il pubblico. Perché adesso possiamo riprendere la lezione.
Sì, benissimo. Quindi siamo...
Allora, bene, siamo ritornati allora in diretta.
So we're online again with streaming. We'll pick up the lesson, and I'll let Father Andrea continue. So the Second Vatican Council is the soul of this part. And so it's this text on Gaudium and Spes, number 16, a fundamental one. Also to look in depth at this. I'll read it. In the depths of his or her conscience, a person detects a law, which he or she does not impose upon themselves, but which holds them to obedience, always summoning them to love good and avoid evil. The voice of conscience, when necessary, speaks to their heart. Do this, shun that. For a person has in their heart a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of the person, and according to it they will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a person. There they are alone with God, whose voice echoes in their depths. In a wonderful manner, conscience reveals that law which is fulfilled by love of God and neighbour. In fidelity to conscience, Christians are joined with the rest of people in the search for truth and for the genuine solution to the numerous problems which arise in the life of individuals from social relationships. Hence, the more right conscience holds sway, the more persons and groups turn aside from blind choices and strive to be guided by the objective norms of morality. Conscience frequently errs from invincible ignorance without losing its dignity. The same cannot be said for a person who cares but little for truth and goodness, or for a conscience which by degrees grows practically sightless as a result of habitual sin. That's the end of the quote. So first of all, we find here the vision of conscience as being closely linked to the very existence of the human person. Thanks to conscience, we are human beings. It's not only the pure individual reflection of the moral order, not even the simple applicative judgment of the moral norm. It's the most secret core and sanctuary of a person. There he or she is alone with God, whose voice echoes in their depths. The interiority of the human person here plays an irreplaceable role. It constitutes the person as a reality who's superior to corporal things. For by their interior qualities, he or she outstrips the whole sum of mere things. They plunge into the depths of reality whenever they enter into their own heart. God, who probes the heart, awaits them there, and there they discern their proper destiny beneath the eyes of God. That's number 14. The meeting with God takes place in this interiority. It's an encounter in person, not first of all an encounter with a law that refers to relationships that necessarily exist, but it's in the person's conscience that the human person deeply touches the very truth of things and can transform the truth thus encountered into a decision. That's still number 14 of Gaudium et Spes. The interiority of conscience is not, therefore, an interiority of isolation, but of communion, of dialogue, of word. It's a meeting you to you with God, a listening to his voice, a rediscovering his word as a truth, as a universal appeal. But it's also a discovering of others as an appeal, as a word, as reciprocity. Number 12 of Gaudium et Spes, which founds the whole anthropological vision in its being the image of God, immediately underlines the indispensable dimension of human communion. Quote, "But God didn't create a person as a solitary, for from the beginning, male and female, he created them. Their companionship produces the primary form of interpersonal communion, for by his innermost nature, man is a social being, and unless he relates to others, he can neither live nor develop his potential." This is number 12. These are all like a preparation towards number 16. It's this dialogical human interiority that discovers and experiences the moral imperative that goes so far as to discover and assume what needs to be done here and now. Quote, in 16, "In the depths of conscience, a person detects a law which they do not impose upon themselves, but which holds them to obedience. Also summoning them to love good and avoid evil, the voice of conscience, when necessary, speaks in their heart. Do this, shun that." I've quoted it again to emphasize this. Otherwise, we won't remember it. So it's not just a matter of a practical judgment as the end point. In conscience, there's something deeper, total, more demanding. It's the person themselves who experience that they are constituting an imperative characterized by something obligatory and imperative in being able and having to determine one's own reality. So the need to decide about oneself, about one's self-giving to others, about one's way of existing in reciprocity, is rooted in conscience. It can't therefore be limited only to techno-scientific truths, and not even to that deeper truth, which is intelligible truth, because this is a truth that's not translated into words. Now, I quote number 15. Maybe I didn't put it right on the screen. 15 says, "The intellectual nature of the human person is perfected by wisdom and needs to be, for wisdom gently attracts the mind of the person to a quest and a love for what is true and good. Steeped in wisdom, he or she passes through visible realities to those which are unseen. With the gift of the Holy Spirit, they can come in faith to contemplate and taste the mystery of the divine plan." So conscience reaches the deepest level of reality, that of the meaning that faith recognizes in the mystery of Christ. The imperative reality that it discovers is that of the meaning arising from the mystery of Christ. The law arises within this imperative reality, so it's not offensive to, but constitutive of the dignity which is proper to the human person. For people have in their hearts a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of the person. According to it, he or she will be judged. In Gaudium et Spes 17, the Constitution recalls that the highest sign of the divine image lies precisely in freedom. This freedom requires that the human person acts according to a knowing and free choice that's personally motivated and prompted from within, not under blind internal impulse, nor by mere external pressure. Personal beliefs are valid as such because it's precisely in them that the possibility of acting freely resides. It's added, however, that, and this is number 17, the person achieves such dignity when, emancipating themselves from more like captivity to passion, they pursue their goal in a spontaneous choice of what is good and procure for themselves, through effective and skillful actions, apt helps to that end. So, specifying the contents of the law, number 16 doesn't refer to relationships that must necessarily occur, but to charity. The law finds its fulfillment in the love of God and of neighbour. The moral truth will thus come to be enucleated as the truth of fidelity to conscience, of searching, of communion. Number 16 again. In fidelity to conscience, Christians unite with others in seeking the truth and in solving in the truth the many moral problems that arise both in the lives of individuals and in social life. In this way, moral truth is not the result of definitions, but of faithfulness to conscience, shared and sought incessantly. Thanks to this shared faithfulness, it's possible to move away from arbitrariness and selfish relativism. This is still 16. It says, the more right conscience holds sway, the more persons and groups turn aside from blind choices and strive to be guided by the objective norms of morality. It will then be a question of an objectivity of persons, of charity, of loyal fidelity, of consciences that engage with each other, of a searching that's not dismayed in the face of the ever new problems that the journey of humanity incessantly pose. It will always be a question of a moral truth, which is the fruit of consciences searching authentically. And the same moral norms will be the qualifying criterion of this investigation. The final reminder of number 16 of Gaudium et Spes regarding the invincibly erroneous conscience confirms this reading. Conscience frequently errs from invincible ignorance without losing its dignity. Dignity isn't lost because it's not first the dignity of conforming to the objective law, but the dignity of loyal faithfulness to oneself, of conforming to the law of the voice of the heart, of searching. In this sense, it upholds the dignity of the person. Conscience loses its dignity only when this is lacking. The same cannot be said for a person who cares but little for truth and goodness, or for a conscience which by degrees grows practically sightless as a result of habitual sin. So in this text, we've had a direction that the Council gives us, which indicates the path, the direction for everything that happens next. And Gaudium, it says in 16, clearly indicates this direction. At the centre of the discourse, there's no longer an order, but an economy, or if you like, an order of charity. That of Christ, the new man, and of the person in communion with God and with brothers and sisters. Moral truth, therefore, is not the application of an impersonal norm. It's the truth of loyal fidelity to oneself, of listening to charity, to God's voice, a new law, of discernment carried out as a community. We repeat, moral truth is the truth of conscience. In other parts of Gaudium et Spes, there's also a return to conscience. In fact, it mentions it 43 times. The Constitution recalls that fulfilling one's earthly duties faithfully, letting oneself be guided by the spirit of the gospel, is indispensable for every true believer, and that the laity are properly engaged in temporal commitments and activities, even if not exclusively. This will require their being competent with respect to the laws of each discipline, an ability to cooperate, and innovative courage. It's generally the function of their well-formed conscience to see that the divine law is inscribed in the life of the earthly city. This is from number 43. And it continues, for this they're urged to assume their own responsibility in the light of Christian wisdom, while paying respectful attention to the doctrine of the magisterium. This step is important. It's the competence of conscience to decide in history and for history, and for this reason the need for its formation arises. In this regard, the ecclesial magisterium is not a substitute for your conscience, nor should it be thought of as an offer of practical recipes to be translated into action, but it has a ministerial function with regard to conscience, so that it may seek and arrive at authentic decisions. So practical truth is always the truth of a search which takes place in history. A search that the person must undertake in conscience, in a sincere confrontation with others, without the exploitation of the same authority. And it's a search that the person cannot delegate, even to ecclesial authority. According to the logic of the conciliar dictate, this would mean an attack not only on the dignity of conscience, but also on the very ministry of authority. So that's the end of this new step from Vatican II. So now let's look at what Paul VI has continued to say about this. He strongly emphasizes the ecclesial and social dimensions of conscience and returns to the personal dimension. In 1964, he speaks of the ecclesial dimension and also the social one in 67. But then he speaks to the personal dimension in the objective criteria in Humanae Vitae, which was 68. So let's look at some of the ecclesial and social conscience ideas. The ecclesial conscience is something that we can see clearly in the encyclical of Paul VI, Ecclesiam Suam. And this one addresses the Church's need to deepen the awareness that she must have of herself, of the treasure of truth of which she is the heir and guardian, and of the mission she must exercise in the world. That's number 19. Essential to this awareness is vigilance in order to identify the good to be done, given that, quote, Christ aimed at developing in people a psychological as well as a moral awareness. And this awareness was an awareness of their discipleship, which was later to have the effect of recalling to their minds everything that Jesus had taught them and everything that had happened to them. And it was something that would grow to maturity. And then at last, people would understand who Jesus was and the meaning of what he had taught and done. So this is the psychological conscience. It's something new, this, which isn't the same as the moral conscience. Self-conscience, which then is lived out in morality. Such as conscience is indispensable for living one's vocation and offering to the world the gospel message of fraternity and salvation. By avoiding the risks of becoming confused, bewildered, and alarmed by some abstruse, barren, absurd, and wholly fallacious conclusions which arrive from the novelty of modern culture, it will be possible to create a positive encounter with the most characteristic instances of our time. Consistent Christian witness doesn't oppose or isolate conscience, but puts it in fruitful dialogue with the whole of humanity. All things human are our concern. We share with the whole of the human race a common nature, a common life, with all its gifts and all its problems. We're ready to play our part in this primary universal society, to acknowledge the insistent demands of its fundamental needs, and to applaud the new and often sublime expressions of its genius. But there are moral values of the utmost importance which we have to offer it, and these are of advantage to everyone. Now, if we go to the encyclical Populorum Progressio from 67, we can see this growth of these ideas, which is opening up to the social conscience. Alongside this ecclesial dimension, Paul VI's teaching insists on the social dimension, open to sincere solidarity. The pages of Populorum Progressio are still significant in this regard today, with the strength of their denunciation and above all with the frank stimulus to sharing and renewal. It's not just and now I quote, "It's not just a question of eliminating hunger and reducing poverty. It's not just a question of fighting wretched conditions, though this is an urgent and necessary task. It involves building a human community where people can live truly human lives, free from discrimination on account of race, religion, or nationality, free from servitude to others or to natural forces which they cannot yet control satisfactorily. It involves building a human community where liberty is not an idle word, where the needy Lazarus can sit down with the rich person at the same table. On the part of the rich, it calls for great generosity, sacrifice, and diligent effort. Each one must examine their conscience, which sounds a new call in our present times." This was in 67. And in 68, the strong and difficult encyclical of Humanae Vitae. And we'll finish with this and then have a pause. So the encyclical aroused a wide debate in the church, and I'm sure many of you will remember this if you're, and certainly anyone who's older than me. There was a wide debate in the kitsch, not only with regard to the specific problem of contraception, but also with regard to the vision of conscience and its role, especially in relation to moral norms. Conscience is first seen in its quality of dependence on a universal norm, the old idea. And the conscience is obliged to apply this, but for some in this debate, this seems to be the only constitutive and essential element of moral conscience. In a second approach, conscience, informing itself and presenting itself as a decision, assumes as constitutive elements of its judgment not only the universal norm, but also the reality of the individual situation on which it must pronounce itself. Indeed, it's seen as a unique subject with the character of responsibility and commitment of the whole person, individual or shared, as in the case of married life. It's not a question of a reasoning on a universal truth to be singled out, but of a deliberation within the context of the life of a person or two people whom God has united in a single existential reality, and they were two in one flesh. This deliberation tends towards a vital synthesis of the tension of the person, whether individual or married, in relation to God. And the existential reality to which the tension towards God is conditioned, conscience appears as a search and determination of the act that here and now realizes this synthesis, without falling into relativism or moral rigorism. This concise conception of conscience strongly emphasizes the evolutionary character of the Christian personality, and therefore of the synthesis that conscience seeks and indicates, so that this is always in eschatological tension towards the fullness of time in the risen Christ. And so we'll finish with this last sentence. Error, limits, imperfections, even sin can be assumed here. They can be assumed here as Easter moments. That is, not as a pure negativity to be discarded, but as opportunities for permanent metanoia, of conversion stimulated by the mercy of God, and of the passage towards a new life, always reborn and with ever greater maturity.
Grazie, professor Andrea Vodka.
Thank you very much, Professor Vodka. We'll stop now for a 10-minute break. We'll stop again in 10 more minutes to continue this very interesting part. See you soon.
So welcome everyone and greetings from Melbourne, Australia.
Vi do il benvenuto.
Proprio dal punto di vista sociologico, la materia che insegna.
If today we can reinvent models that we can use, how to use the common goods, there's a risk of ruining the planet. What's the essence of Laudato Si? Mary wasn't forced to follow the plan of God on her. Do you believe Jesus rose again? You have to answer for yourself to this question. At the moment of the resurrection, this book was born, the New Testament. What's that supposed to be?
E con lo spot di UPM 2.0 riprendiamo.
And so, with this publicity spot, we begin again, together with Father Andrea. And now we're moving on from the Second Vatican Council, the most important teaching documents of the Catholic Church about conscience. So, good evening to everybody. Now, in this second part, I want to speak about conscience in the most recent magisterial documents of what John Paul II said. In the wake of Vatican II, we can look first of all at John Paul II, at Benedict, and at Pope Francis. It's a story that continues. But in the end, we want to reflect on our own life too. John Paul II, for us, is the one who launched the truth as something splendid that fascinates us, the splendor of truth. But before this encyclical, he'd spoken quite a lot about conscience. Also in the exhortation, reconciliation, and penance, when he talks about our conversion, the conscience is relevant. In fact, in 1984, he speaks about it 44 times in this exhortation. One little quote. Today, the interior sanctuary, the person's innermost self, their conscience, is too often attacked, put to the test, confused and obscured. It's like an inner eye, like a visual capacity of the Spirit, able to guide our steps along the path of good. One's personal conscience needs to be properly formed, lest it become a force which is destructive of the true humanity of the person, rather than the holy place where God reveals to him his true good. Now we move on to the encyclical Dominum et Vivificantem from 86, where we'll hear the word conscience spoken 45 times. But I'll just give you one quote, because it's something no one has said before. The salvific value of not just remorse. Let me read. The salvific value of the same remorse of conscience, in that it participates in some way in the disapproval, which by inscribing itself in the heart of the Trinity, by virtue of eternal love, is translated into the pain of the cross. It's strong. When the Spirit of truth allows the human conscience to participate in that pain, then the suffering of conscience becomes particularly profound, but also particularly saving. Then, through an act of perfect contrition, authentic conversion of the heart takes place. It's the evangelical metanoia. It's worth rereading this encyclical. Now we'll go to the strong encyclical of Veritatis Splendor of 93. 107 times it speaks of conscience. In the main trends of
proprio come Veritatis Splendor, e alla coscienza è assegnato un posto.
that the conscience is given a really important place in this encyclical. Before the more specific discussion, the encyclical affirms the inner character of ethical requirements, which don't impose themselves on the will as an obligation, except by virtue of the prior recognition of human reason, and in concrete terms of personal conscience. Creativity in the moral life is necessary. Life requires the creativity and ingenuity proper to the person, the source and cause of their deliberate acts. The specific section, Conscience and Truth, talks about the person's sanctuary, of the judgment of conscience, and of the search for truth and the good. The classical talks whenever we speak of conscience. The freedom of the person and the law of God have in their relationship the living seat in the heart of the person, that is, in their moral conscience. Particular emphasis is placed on the judgment made by conscience, which places the person before the law, which becomes in itself a witness for him or her. It's a witness to their fidelity or infidelity with regard to the law, that is, to their essential moral rectitude or iniquity. That's 57. Conscience is equally a witness of God himself, whose voice and whose judgment penetrate the inner person to the roots of the soul, calling him or her with strength and gentleness to obedience. Number 58. Moral conscience does not close the person within an unsurmountable and impenetrable solitude, but opens them to the call, to the voice of God. In this, and not in anything else, lies the entire mystery and the dignity of the moral conscience, in being the place, the sacred place, where God speaks to men and women. It refers back to Gaudium and Spes 16. This testimony takes concrete form in a practical judgment, which commands what the person must do or not do, or that evaluates an act they've already completed. So it expresses that primordial insight about good and evil, that reflection of God's creative wisdom, which, like an imperishable spark, shines in the heart of every person.
Meraviglia che il Papa cerca di
We
far vedere.
shouldn't be surprised that the Pope wants to show us this splendor of life, that there's a light, an original light, which is our conscience. It's an imperishable spark that shines in the heart of each person. And the conscience is also the application of the law to a particular case, which thus becomes for the human person an inner dictate, a summons to do what's good in this particular situation. Conscience therefore arises as a personal, proximate norm of morality that decides. personal. The divine law is instead the universal and objective norm of morality. It's more remote. The judgment of conscience doesn't establish the law, but it bears witness to the authority of the natural law and of the practical reason with reference to the supreme good, whose attractiveness the human person perceives and whose commandments he accepts. In the practical judgment of conscience, the bond of freedom with truth is revealed. Precisely for this reason, conscience expresses itself with acts of judgment that reflect the truth about the good and not as arbitrary decisions. The maturity and responsibility of these judgments, and ultimately of the human person who is its subject, are measured not by the liberation of conscience from objective truth in favour of an alleged autonomy of its own decisions, but on the contrary, by a pressing search for truth and by being guided by it in action. So conscience is not an infallible judge. It can err. It's a mystery. When error is due to invincible ignorance, which is blameless, conscience doesn't lose its dignity. As Gaudium and Spes said, it doesn't lose its dignity because while orienting itself in a way that differs from the objective moral order, it doesn't cease to speak in the name of that truth about the good that the subject is called to sincerely seek. But it's never acceptable to confuse a subjective error regarding the moral good with the objective truth rationally proposed to a person by virtue of its end, nor to equate the moral value of the act carried out with a true and right conscience, with that carried out following the judgment of an erroneous conscience. The evil committed because of invincible ignorance or an error of judgment that's blameless may not be attributable to the person who does it, but even in this case, it doesn't cease to be an evil, a disorder, in relation to the truth about the good. In the formation of conscience, regarding the discernment of God's will, of what is good, pleasing to him and perfect, this is from the letter to the Romans, a sort of co-naturality between the person and the true good is indispensable. We're friends, co-naturality. We're close. The person and true good. A similar co-naturality is rooted and developed in the virtuous attitudes of persons themselves, prudence and the other cardinal virtues, and even before that, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Freedom of conscience is never freedom from the truth, but always and only freedom in the truth. This is the essence of what we've been saying. The magisterium manifests to conscience the truths which it ought already to possess, developing them from the original act of faith. And the Church puts herself always and only at the service of conscience, helping it to avoid being tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine proposed by human deceit, and helping it not to swerve from the truth about the good of the person, but rather especially in more difficult questions to attain the truth with certainty and to abide in it. That's the end of John Paul II. Thank you for the things that you've said. And we move on now to Pope Benedict briefly. He speaks of conscience as in a less explicit way, but as the reality which is the heart of life. The vision of Christian life present in the encyclicals of Benedict XVI presuppose the existence of mature consciences, open and committed to the search for good. The first quote that I want to take from this Deus Caritas Est, I mentioned it before about the harmonization of the human heart with the heart of Christ. Here's another beautiful quote, the only one I take from this encyclical that was written in 2005, and only 4 times he mentions the word conscience.
Benedetto dice così:
He says, there's a need for a formation of the heart for all those who want to concretize the charity of the Church. Those who work for the Church's charitable organizations dedicate themselves to others with heartfelt concern, enabling them to experience the richness of their humanity.
Perciò
Consequently, in addition to their necessary professional training, these charity workers need a formation of the heart. That's number 31. For Pope Benedict, conscience is always the biblical understanding of the heart. Then, 2 years later, in 2007, the encyclical Spe Salvi, this word comes up 5 times. The encounter with God awakens the conscience, which becomes the capacity for listening to good itself. John Paul spoke about the inner eye. Here arises the need for sharing and compassion in order to give adequate answers. It was the Christian faith that had the particular merit of bringing forth within humankind a new and deeper capacity for these kinds of suffering that are decisive for their humanity. Compassion. The person is worth so much to God that God became man in order to suffer with mankind in an utterly real way, in flesh and blood, as is revealed to us in the account of Jesus' passion. Here there isn't the word conscience, but it's a dimension that's a meaning of it which is brought out. Then in Caritas in Veritate from 2009, it's mentioned 15 times. The relationship of conscience with truth is fundamental for Benedict XVI. The social doctrine of the Church is Caritas in Veritate in Social Re. It's the proclamation of the truth of Christ's love in society. Without truth, without trust and love for what is true, there's no social conscience and responsibility. And social action ends up serving private interests and the logic of power, resulting in social fragmentation, especially in a globalized society at difficult times like the present. That was 2009. In the context of globalized society, the Church feels that her particular task is to foster the reciprocity of consciences. I want to add, it was Father Hering who promoted this expression of reciprocity of consciences. The sharing of goods and resources from which authentic development proceeds is not guaranteed by merely technical progress and relationships of utility, but by the potential of love that overcomes evil with good, opening up the path towards reciprocity of consciences and liberties. The Christian community is called to play an essential role in this regard, without ever transforming its ministry into a search for power, and always respecting the different skills that exist in social and economic life. And we can thank Pope Benedict for what he said here. There are just a few ideas I want to give you to encourage you to go more in depth. And now I want to go on to Pope Francis, because there would be so much to say here. The first thing that Pope Francis speaks about conscience, he says it's relational. And that's something we need to go into depth. It's alone with God, but it's always in a relationship, as our course is. And it means seeing with the eyes of Jesus. It's light. In Benedict, we had the ear. Now with Francis, we've got eyes, we've got our vision. And the first thing I want to talk about, the encyclical Lumen Fidei, the first one from 2013, where just once he uses this word conscience, but also in the sense of self-awareness. The term conscience occurs here only once in the sense of self-awareness. Persons always live in relationship. We come from others, we belong to others, and our lives are enlarged by our encounter with others. Even our own knowledge and self-awareness are relational. They're linked to others who've gone before us. So conscience isn't isolated. The implicit references begin with the way in which the light of faith is summarized. Often, Piero Coda spoke about the faith that comes, not a blind faith, but the faith that comes from our eyes. And the light of faith, a light that has a particular aspect capable of lighting up all of human existence. A light so powerful can't come from ourselves, but from a more primordial source. In a word, it must come from God. We come to see that faith doesn't dwell in shadow and gloom. It's a light for our darkness. That's from Lumen Fidei number 4. Faith doesn't merely gaze at Jesus, but it sees things as Jesus himself sees them, with his own eyes. It's a participation in his way of seeing. And this is possible thanks to the Holy Spirit. So we've got another way of looking at conscience that for us Christians, it has to be linked to faith. It has to coincide also at the level of light. The Christian can have the eyes of Jesus, his feelings, his filial disposition, because he or she is made a sharer in his love, which is the Spirit. It's in this love that the vision proper to Jesus is received in some way. So conscience as the vision of Jesus. And finally, we find implicit references to the reality of conscience in the 4th chapter, dedicated to the way in which faith enters into relationship with social reality and tends to transform it. The last quote from this encyclical, faith reveals just how firm the bonds between people can be when God is present in their midst. These are our texts. Faith doesn't merely grant interior firmness, a steadfast conviction on the part of the believer. It also sheds light on every human relationship because it's born of love and reflects God's own love. The God who is himself reliable gives us a city which is reliable. This is something you say you could even write your thesis on it. Now let's move on to Evangelii Gaudium, where this word comes in 14 times. The exhortation concludes the 13th Ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops on the new evangelization for the transmission of the Christian faith. There aren't many explicit references to conscience, although the whole discourse presupposes its centrality in the missionary conversion that Pope Francis wants to promote. Conscience can lose its value if it turns in on itself. In the context of the multiple and oppressive supply of consumerism, it's an individualistic sadness that springs from a comfortable and greedy heart,
Dalla ricerca
from the sick search for superficial pleasures, from the conscience that's isolated.
non vi è più
There's no longer room for others, no place for the poor. God's voice is no longer heard. The quiet joy of his love is no longer felt, and the desire to do good fades. Believers also run this risk, which is certain and permanent. This is from Evangelii Gaudium. It's only thanks to the encounter or re-encounter with the love of God in Christ, which turns into happy friendship, that we are redeemed from our isolated conscience and from self-referentiality. We come to be fully human when we let God bring us beyond ourselves so as to attain the fullest truth of our being. And in order for the church to be a mother with an open heart, her true conscience must, in a way that's holy, know how to worry and be concerned with so many brothers and sisters who live without the strength and light and consolation of friendship with Jesus Christ, without a community of faith to welcome them, without a horizon of meaning and life. Here, a positive type of faith is defined, that of becoming shut up within structures which give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us harsh judges, within habits which make us feel safe, while at our door people are starving. And Jesus doesn't tire of saying to us, give them something to eat, as in Mark's Gospel. Deepening social dialogue in a context of religious freedom, Francis observes. It's one of the longer quotes I'll give. He says, a healthy pluralism, one which genuinely respects differences and values them as such, doesn't entail privatizing religions in an attempt to reduce them to the quiet obscurity of the individual's conscience, or to relegate them to the enclosed precincts of churches, synagogues, or mosques. This would represent, in effect, a new form of discrimination and authoritarianism. The respect due to the agnostic or non-believing minority shouldn't be arbitrarily imposed in a way that silences the conviction of the believing majority or ignores the wealth of religious traditions. And lastly, speaking of the missionary power of intercessory prayer, he states, when evangelizers rise from prayer, their hearts are more open, freed of self-absorption, their desirous of doing good and sharing their lives with others. These explicit references to conscience should be read in the light of the guiding perspectives of the exhortation, with the emphasis on dialogue and respect for the path of the other towards the good, as well as the consequent vision of evangelization as accompaniment. And now I'm about to end. Other developments in the thought of Pope Francis. But we're limited by time, so I couldn't really look in depth at Amoris Laetitia, but maybe you can do this later. But for personal study, we offer a statistical look at the recurrence of the term in the encyclical letter Laudato Si and in the post-synodal exhortation Amoris Laetitia, with similar data taken from Evangelium Gaudium. As a reminder, in Evangelii Gaudium, there are some fundamental characteristics of conscience: isolated, self-referential, liberated, redeemed, reassured, restless. They come up again in Laudato Si from 2015, In the document, there is first of all an awareness of the environmental challenge and its human roots. Consequently, it's a question of the commitment to develop new lifestyles at every level of social life which are open to change. In Amoris Laetitia, the post-synodal apostolic exhortation, other characteristics, other kinds of conscience, maybe we can say it's right, certain, formed. These can be traced, and it's possible to see a clear indication that conscience cannot be substituted, and therefore of the need for the formation of conscience. And with reference to the necessary formation of conscience and its dignity, a clear reference is made in this magisterial text to a specific text of the Second Vatican Council, number 16 of Gaudium et Spes, which, as we've seen, offers an enlightened phenomenological description of conscience. That's where we began. And here, it's not that we're ending because we can't end. Many thanks. The applause from the hall of Rocca di Papa at the center of the movement, from where we're transmitting this lesson of the UPM, says how grateful we are for this flight from the Second Vatican Council to today through the different documents of the magisterium. And I hope that it's something like a menu that's made us have the desire to go more in depth in some of these documents, if not all of them, because often the documents that are written as letters, exhortations, often written to everybody, to all believers, not just to specialists in subject. So now, before stopping for a longer break that we need, I'd like to bring out a few points to give a brief summary that can help us maybe to ask questions. And I think the real key, the glasses with which to read this, is number 1 of Gaudium et Spes, which is at the heart of the Vatican Council. The anguish and despair of people today, which are also the worries of the Church that feels it's called to work together with people. Since Vatican II, we've seen that the Church takes care of this development of what's happening in humanity. So one of the great categories of the last century is this of relationships, which we see straight away in Gaudium et Spes. Conscience is a dialogue. It's entering first and foremost in a relationship of you to you with God. Then we look at the conscience that takes up in dialogue with psychology and social sciences. John Paul II, at the heart of his magisterium, speaks about person. And he looks at the concrete situation of the person, and in particular. And that's why it's necessary for the conscience to be formed. Benedict, who was a great theologian, he speaks about conscience towards truth, but which is always symphonic, to use an expression of von Balthasar. But above all, it's conscience linked to truth. And Francis makes this symphony explode in a plurality of diversity that we need to be open to so as not to be closed, but to be always open to the other, to avoid being closed in self-awareness, being closed to the poor, and so the plurality of others is made up particularly by the poor, by those who don't believe, by those who ask questions about God and environment. So from the Vatican Council till today, with all the challenges, with the different problems and challenges that the last century lived and the Church welcomed. Thank you very much to Father Andre. A 20-minute break now. And if you want to ask questions to the number that's here, and then we'll put some of them together. Some have already arrived. But then after the pause, we'll have a second input.
La sintesi, basterebbe proprio la sintesi.
Thank you for that summary that you made. That's great.
They're rushing out.
Yeah. It's a very interesting picture for UPM. As long as they don't do all those silly stories again.
So here we are back again in direct transmission from the center of the movement in Rocca di Papa, and we're going to carry on with the second part of our lesson today, our lesson of the popular Marian University. The theme of the second part is quite a sensitive theme. Above all, at the moment, Pope Francis has spoken about these concepts various times, and we're talking about the external and internal forum. It's a legal type of language, and it needs to be explained. And so to explain this, we're going to ask Raphael Takugang to do this. He's a lawyer. He's part of the Legal Association in Cameroon. He's done a postgraduate degree in pedagogy, and he's also studied canon law in the Lateran University in Rome. So he's got some expertise in all of these subjects. It's his daily bread. And he's at the moment in Nairobi, and he's going to speak to us from Nairobi. So, good afternoon. What I'm going to talk about today's title is the contribution from canon law to the distinction between the internal and external forum. I have to say at the outset that this is a subject that will never be completely exhausted, firstly because life is constantly evolving, and also because the Church itself is continually called upon to respond to the changing concerns of the faithful. The title, as it stands, could make it seem that the canons of canon law deal explicitly and structurally with these two fora, internal and external. But this is not so. Everything that the Code of Canon Law says about the internal forum and external forum is deduced from various canons which speak about the power of governance, the obligations and rights of the faithful, the formation of clergy, superiors and councils in religious institutes, the minister of the sacrament of reconciliation, and so on. However, canon law has always been interested in these two notions, although in the Decretum of Gratian, the first collection of sources of canon law, there's no explicit mention of either the external forum or the internal forum in the sense that they have today. It is true to say that from the period of interpretation of the sources of ecclesiastical law, that the notion of internal and external forum, or internal forum, which is known as forum conscientiae, began to develop. From the 16th century onwards, with the birth of moral theology, there was a progressive separation between the juridical sphere relating to the external forum and the sphere relating to conscience and the internal forum. The latter became the almost exclusive preserve of the reflections of moral theologians. It was not until Francisco Suarez, a 16th century Spanish Jesuit, that the institution of the internal forum came to be associated with the power of jurisdiction, that is, the power granted by Christ to his apostles to rule and govern the faithful and direct them in their journey to eternal life. After the Second Vatican Council, the Church began a long process of revision of the 1917 canon law, establishing some basic principles that were to guide the work of this revision. What was included was the need to distinguish more clearly between the external and internal forum by clarifying the boundaries between the question of a juridical nature, which governs the internal forum, and questions of a moral nature, which are totally outside the juridical sphere. So let's try and define the terms. Current canonical legislation has made it a better distinction between the juridical and the moral spheres and has more clearly defined the boundaries between these two fora. All references to the forum of conscience has been eliminated in order to better present the juridical nature of the internal forum. The sacrament of reconciliation is only one of the places where the Church exercises its power of jurisdiction when it's necessary to resolve questions of a juridical nature without the need for these questions to become public knowledge. On the other hand, the internal forum is not limited just to the sacramental sphere, since the same power may also be exercised outside of confession without having made public, in any case, facts that are not already public. A simplistic definition would be to consider the internal forum as the realm of conscience, while the external forum would concern the realm of governance. In reality, it would be more correct to say that the interior or inner forum corresponds to the judgment of an act in relation to one's conscience, while the external or outer forum corresponds to the judgment of an act in relation to external objective criteria. The external forum is the space where we speak of external things, visible acts, public actions, while the internal forum is the space of the private sphere of the faithful, of their conscience and interior life. The criterion for distinguishing between the external and internal forum does not relate to the subject matter, but to the degree of public knowledge that a person wishes to give to certain situations, certain legal situations. Therefore, the individual decides whether a given question is to be examined in the external forum or the internal forum. This decision comes with the proviso that once the question has been dealt with in the external forum, the person is no longer free to restrict it to the internal forum. The criterion is that the external forum cannot be returned to the internal forum. Canon 130 of the present Code of Canon Law states, "Of itself, the power of governance is exercised for the external forum. Sometimes, however, it's exercised for the internal forum only, but in such a way that the effects which its exercise is designed to have in the external forum are not acknowledged in that forum, except insofar as the law prescribes this for determinate cases." This canon highlights the difficulty of establishing a clear separation between the two fora, because in the same person, in their wholeness, the spiritual and material dimensions coexist in a constant interweaving. The interior choices that a person makes produce effects in the exterior actions that he or she performs. Let's look more at the external forum. The external forum is what we do in relation to society, to others, and for which we are accountable. It's the sphere that encompasses public acts, observable behavior, as well as the objective consequences that may occur. We're dealing here with visible acts, external actions in ordinary life. At the end of a formation period, for instance, the rector of a seminary will propose or advise against the ordination of a candidate to the priesthood on the basis of observing outward visible behavior of the seminarian. The Church, whose main purpose is salus animae, the health of the soul, uses juridical norms to order the lives of the faithful in temporal and spiritual ways so that they can be according to God's plan. Through the power of jurisdiction over external and internal acts of the faithful, the Church ensures that what is done by individuals and communities confirms with its teaching. Acts performed in the external forum are under the jurisdiction of those who exercise the power of governance. In the seminary, for example, the rector, on the basis of behavior noted by him or someone else, will make the candidate aware that their attitudes that are not in keeping with the priestly ministry to which they aspire. They may be attitudes that focus on appearances which are particularly aggressive or particularly passive, or tend towards domination of others, etc. It's true that in monitoring these visible and public actions, those who exercise the power of governance must be careful not to abuse the power they have over those who have objectively failed to comply with the rule established for the good of individuals and the community. The dignity of the person and his or her freedom of conscience and rights as a human being must always be respected. Now let's look at the internal forum. The internal forum concerns our private and most intimate life that may be shared with a spiritual accompanier, in the case of our relationship with God, or times with a confessor, but always under the seal of confidentiality. It must remain in the internal forum. That is, it cannot be communicated to third parties without our consent. The internal forum is the forum of the inner conscience of the faithful, who open their inner selves to their spiritual director in order to better understand what God wants from them. No one can decide in the place of the conscience of the believer, not even the spiritual director. It's always up to the believer in front of their conscience and God to make every decision. The internal forum is bound by the obligation of absolute secrecy. This guarantees both the believer the opportunity to address any question he or she considers important for their spiritual journey, and at the same time guarantees the spiritual director the freedom to ask the believer to share all the director feels is needed for adequate spiritual guidance. Pope Francis has lost no opportunity to remind everyone of the sacredness of the obligation to secrecy for everything that touches the internal forum. Here's what he said. The internal forum must never go outside. And I say this because I've realized that in some groups in the church, representatives, superiors, let's put it this way, blend the two things together and take from the internal forum to make decisions in the external forum and vice versa. No, this is a sin. It's a sin against the dignity of the person who trusts the priest and who expresses his or her own situation to ask for forgiveness and finds this is used to organize matters for a group or a movement. Perhaps, I don't know, I'm improvising. Maybe even a new congregation. I don't know. The internal forum is the internal forum. This is what the Pope said in the audience to the dicastery, the penitentiary dicastery in 2019. The internal forum can be subdivided into the sacramental or penitential internal forum, which is exercised in the sacrament of reconciliation or connected to it, and the extra-sacramental internal forum. The internal sacramental forum is described in a note from the 29th of June 2019, considered it urgent to underline the absolute inviolability of the sacramental seal, which is founded on divine law and admits no exceptions. The priest, the confessor, acting in persona Christi Capitis, comes to know the sins of the penitent, not as man, but as God, according to a well-known expression of St. Thomas Aquinas. For this reason, the priest must defend the secrecy of the content of confession, not only out of loyalty to the penitent, but even more out of respect for the sanctity of the sacrament. The secrecy of confession is not an externally imposed obligation, but it's an intrinsic requirement of the sacrament, and as such cannot be dissolved even by the penitent. This means that even if the penitent asks the priest to speak about a matter they've discussed during confession, he cannot do so. If trust in this seal of confession were to be broken, the faithful would be discouraged from going to confession, to going to the sacrament of reconciliation. And this, of course, would be a great detriment to souls. On the other hand, it's precisely this concern for the health of the soul that moves the Church to establish the severest penalties for those who violate this seal of confession. This inviolability is enshrined in Canons 983 and 984 of the current Code of Canon Law, which not only prevent the confessor from referring to the sins of the penitent, but also forbid those in authority from using knowledge of sins gained during confession in making decisions regarding governance. They cannot use the knowledge gained in confession for making decisions which regard external matters. In this respect, Canon 1388 of the Code of Canon Law punishes the confessor who directly violates the seal of confession with automatic excommunication. This same penalty is also mentioned in Canons 728 and 1456 in the Canon Law of the Eastern Churches. This sacramental seal is stronger than what's referred to as professional secret, which has exceptions legitimately provided for by national institutions. On the other hand, any legislative initiative aimed at forcing the inviolability of the sacramental seal would be a violation of religious freedom, and this is normally protected by temporal powers. Also, regarding the protection of the sacramental internal forum, Canon 630, number 4, prohibits superiors from hearing the confessions of people subordinate to them unless spontaneously requested to do so. Now we go on to the internal forum outside of the sacrament. There are also acts of the internal forum that take place outside the sacrament. The classic example of this regards spiritual direction. In this case too, canon law guarantees a special confidentiality for spiritual conversations, which involve the most intimate and personal sphere of the person, while listening to and discerning the will of God. Canon 240 of the Code of Canon Law expresses this formally, saying that on the occasion of admission or dismissal from holy orders, that is to the priesthood, it's forbidden to seek the opinion not only of the confessor, but also forbidden to seek the impression of the candidate spiritual director. The reason is that even unconsciously, the judgment of the director would be influenced by the things that the seminarian has confided to him in a spiritual conversation. The believer who freely opens up the secret of their conscience to his or her spiritual director, who may be a priest, another consecrated person, a lay person, thus entrusts to this person their path to holiness in order for them to be guided and supported in listening to the will of God. The believer needs to be certain that the intimate aspects of their life that they reveal will not be divulged. The interlocutor will keep these secrets for the rest of their life. Every person's right to privacy is connected by Canon 220 of the 1983 Code of Canon Law, which states, "No one may unlawfully harm the good reputation which a person enjoys, or violate the right of any person to protect his or her own privacy." This duty, which corresponds to a human right, known as the right to a good name or reputation, is generally protected by national legislation. The Code uses the word unlawfully, which means that when a greater good of persons, society or the church is at stake, one can also highlight offences committed by a member of the faithful. What's to be avoided here is permanent damage to a person's reputation through slander, gossip, insult, or denigration. We can link this right to the protection of people's interior life. Indeed, nobody can be obliged to reveal intimate matters, that is, the internal working of their conscience that leads to actions, objects, consequences. To this end, the current Code of Canon Law in Part 5 of Canon 630 says, the members of a chapter, for instance, are to approach their superiors with trust and be able to open their minds freely and spontaneously to them. Superiors, however, are forbidden in any way to induce the members to make a manifestation of conscience to themselves. Because sharing details of another person's interior life is forbidden. All those who become aware of aspects and matters that are part of another person's interior life are obliged to secrecy. Already in 1890, under Pope Leo XIII, the Sacred Secretary of Bishops and Regulars issued a decree called Quae Modum Omnium Rerum, issued a decree to end abuses that had occurred in some practices of religious life. In this decree, some norms were outlined regarding the practice established in monasteries of revealing intimate elements of conscience and heart to superiors. The decree abrogated every provision in their constitutions that regulated the intimate manifestation of conscience and heart by religious to their superiors. The decree also prohibited all superiors from inducing their subjects in any way to reveal their conscience to them. This was in response to serious abuses of power that had occurred in some monasteries, with rules and practices that superiors used that had become the cause of violations of conscience and abuse of all kinds. Canon 1389 of the current Code of Canon Law punishes by removing from office any authority which in the exercise of governance abuses it to the detriment of others. This canon can be invoked by anyone who feels that he or she has suffered a violation of their internal or external forum. Let's conclude by saying that in a time of mass communication, when information can go viral and often, unfortunately, a part of people's lives, it's essential to relearn the power of words, both their constructive power, but also their destructive potential. We must ensure that everything that touches on the internal forum of each person is never violated by anyone. We must be vigilant in order to safeguard the confidentiality associated with the exercise of all authority, and always keep in mind the fundamental good of persons. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Raphael, for this contribution about the internal and external forum. We've had a few questions for you. I imagine that here, among those present, there probably been sent a few. I'd like to invite Father Andrei Vodka to come and join me here. And we'll be joined by Raphael online. And we're going to look at some of the questions which have arrived. First of all, I would...
Allora incominciamo con il primo.
Let's ask the first question. The question of abuses. In these times where many episodes of abuse of conscience have occurred, the question of conscience could become merely an individual thing, could become a space for self-affirmation instead of the space for relationships with God and with others for the redemption of the world. How can we stop this danger when we're talking about formation of conscience, given that the conscience always has the last word?
It's a complex question. We could ask the same question also to our other speaker.
E dunque? Spetta a me.
It's up to me. Every text is in a context, and it has an impact on how we understand it. After this breath, this springtime, this theological looking in depth at the conscience in the from the council, we look now at the opposite situation, abuse. And the question, specific question here is
una tendenza che ha a che fare con l'autoaffermazione
what to do when it's the self-affirmation of a person that comes about also through the conscience, because the conscience is also vulnerable.
la coscienza coincidendo con la persona
The conscience coincides with the person, and because it's historic like the person, can also make mistakes. And we've said this. It's not an infallible judge.
manipolata.
And in this sense, it can be manipulated.
Essendo poi quel sacrario, come dice,
Because it's that sacred area, as Raphael said, it's super protected, also canonically speaking, that it can't be violated also juridically,
confermata, ci possiamo trovare in una
we might find ourselves in a situation that's not clear,
manipolabilità.
that it's a situation that can be manipulated. And so,
Deriva della possibile autoaffermazione
so this possibility of autoreferentiality, which has an impact on conscience,
della risposta come arginarlo
and how to put this aside,
alla visione positiva
we need to go back to the
ideale
positive, the ideal vision of conscience in itself, so that each one
già avere come un primo istinto
can have a first instinct, natural, supernatural instinct, to stand back, to object to what violates the conscience.
e crescita
But without the formation and the growth of your own personal life with God, from what we've seen in these texts, the conscience is the soul of the soul, as John Paul II said. Also, Edith Stein said this. And this is really precious. It must be protected, not in the military aspect, but
all'irradiazione della presenza
but
intimissima
to
del sole eterno che è
always to be in the light of the eternal light of the love of God,
sana in ogni
and that heals it in every possible temptation
caduta.
if it falls.
Coscienza di per sé
So conscience in itself needs to be cultivated at the level of the first answer. What to do, I would say, don't leave the conscience on its own, as if it was an animal that will feed itself in the woods and will grow. No, conscience has to be looked after, and it has to be looked after with suitable instruments, growing. And certainly,
nel senso cristiano
in the Christian sense,
fonda a quella coscienza che ci è stata manifestata in Gesù.
thinking, going back to the conscience that's revealed to us in Jesus, the God-man, who revealed the eschatological life of conscience also through the cross.
Audita violenza
So
proporci la coscienza
he
bella, splendente.
shows us now the pure conscience, but we've got to look after it to reach this point. So the specific point of this question is the risk of self-affirmation or self-referentialism, or to abuse your power of your conscience to present yourself. What Jesus said in the gospel, I don't remember the exact words, he said that there's a sin which can't be forgiven. And you, what it is? It's the sin against the Holy Spirit, because the person is capable of reversing values, calling good bad and bad good. And Jesus said this, thinking of the manipulation of the Sadducees, the chief priests, and those who were experts in Scripture. Because they felt they had knowledge that they had received, they were looking at the event of Christ as a sin, as an anti-value that had to be eliminated. worse than this doesn't exist. It's not that God doesn't want to forgive this sin, but if I turn upside down the values, I won't even ask forgiveness because I think I'm in the right. So our conscience has to be protected through looking after it, through forming it, through prayer, but also through the capacity of suffering, as John Paul II said, and to be able to suffer, because there's no better formation than being co-crucified, co-dying and rising again with Christ. And in this way, our conscience is freed. It would be a long talk. It's a spiritual one, but also cultural.
Armare, ma un linguaggio
But we need to,
così
it's not the right word, but figuratively speaking, we need to arm the conscience with certain sensitivities. It's vulnerable, it's fragile, but it can be made strong through compassion, because it doesn't escape from the wounds, but it loves them and makes them become part of it. And then it becomes super sensitive for the other, then it will never abuse the other. They're huge subjects that we could talk about. You'd need another laureate to talk about these things. We can't complete this in one lesson. There are questions coming in from different members of the movement, and they concern more the Focolare movement. And so I'll ask Raphael that, and if some of you who are listening maybe don't know a lot about the Focolare, one of the characteristics of our life is the life of communion. So at times in the movement, people communicate their intimate experiences. So it's something to do with the inner forum. And there's lots of questions about this. So if in a meeting of this kind, of a Christian community, as it could be of the Focolare, if someone shares
un aspetto della mia
an
coscienza,
aspect of my conscience, an experience of my conscience, of my relationship with God, is this and this communion then becomes external forum. Is there something? Is there an inner forum for a group and an external forum if we're talking about a group? For example, the inner forum of the Focolare or another congregation or the group in the parish. Also, in this sense, what's the space we should give to this kind of communication?
I hope you can hear me. I've had a bit of difficulty with the connection. I'd like to, first of all, make a premise. I spoke about the internal and external forums, looking at the juridical side of things. It's a huge subject, and I was limited to what the law of the church says on this question. You could also look at the whole question from a moral point of view, a theological point of view. That's not my field. It was simply juridical. So the question posed, I would answer by considering groups. These groups are regulated by norms, norms approved by the church, which sometimes have to be completed. They specify the life of the community. They're in conformity with canon law, because the highest juridical norm of the church is canon law. So every norm that regulates a community has to respect the demands of canon law. And in this sense, The life of community has its specificity, its secret, its intimacy. There is an intimacy of the community. What I say in that particular situation remains there. And outside that particular situation, we don't speak about it. I can open up in a certain environment which I can't do in another. So there's also this secret which must be protected. It could be a focal area, a nucleus. In order to protect the dignity of the person, to protect the intimacy of a person. So to speak about something said in this kind of situation, because how can I say it accurately? How can I say it in the right way? It doesn't automatically become something for the external forum. It must remain within that context, within that situation. I think, Raphael, you've answered quite well, quite clear, concise at this point. However, the time is finished, so we have to say goodbye with a little promise that all of the questions which have arrived in these last few minutes have been sent to the next speakers, Amadeo Ferrari and Paolo Monaco, who will be with us on the 2nd of April for the final lesson in this year's sessions of UPM on moral conscience. And so they'll at least see what questions were asked, and if they find it opportune, they'll integrate answers to those questions in what they say on that date to do with moral conscience, particularly to do with this discernment, as Pope Francis emphasizes. So thank you, Raphael and Father Vodka, for their talks. A very warm greeting and to all of those who followed us from different parts of the world. And thanks to all of you who've followed from the hall here in Rocca di Papa. So goodbye until the 2nd of April.